thoracic example of a lumbar. Obviously, they get bigger in size as you go down. Another difference you'll notice is the spinous process. That's the part that sticks off the back. On a cervical vertebrae, the spinous process is often forked, like this. If you see a forked spinous process, it can only be a cervical vertebrae. It rules out all other options. It is a cervical vertebrae if you see a forked spinous process. The thoracic vertebrae typically has a narrow spinous process that points downward. You can see that from a side angle a little better. And often, some of them point down even much more than that. If you look on an articulated skeleton, you'll see that. The lumbar vertebrae is sort of known for having a shorter spinous process that sticks sort of straight back. Let's see. I'm not showing that to you very well. It's this right here, and it sort of just sticks straight back. Okay, now the next common feature you see on most vertebrae is a body. See, the atlas is different. It doesn't have a spinous process. It doesn't even have a body. That's this part. Here, here, and here. See how it gets bigger? And so, look, I put a sticker on. Most likely, the answer for that one on the exam was body. But what if the sticker was on here and then I had another piece of tape that said type of vertebrae? Then what would you say? Lumbar. Okay, now, so they all have a body, and that's where the intervertebral discs sit, is on the bodies, to in between each of them. Then the next, oh, I need that pointer. One part that they all have, no matter what vertebrae they are, is this. What's this? That is the vertebral foramen, because it's a hole in the vertebrae. Vertebral foramen. And that's where the spinal cord passes. Now the next part you can think of is, if this is where the spinal cord is, do you see how it's completely encased in bone? If it's not, if some part of this doesn't fuse properly when a baby's developing, do you know what that baby has? Spina bifida. Yeah, and it can be mild or it can be severe or life-threatening. So the spinal cord is protected by the body and then what we call the vertebral arch. That's the bone that connects from here and arches around to the body again. And the different parts of that vertebral arch have names. I'm going to walk you through it and then I'm going to show them to you more individually, okay? Pedicle. Actually, let's look on a thoracic vertebrae. It's the simplest. Okay, so here's the body. Pedicle, transverse process, lamina, spinous process, lamina, transverse process, pedicle, body. So the bone that connects the body to the transverse process is called the pedicle. So see it here and here. The bone that connects the transverse process to the spinous process is called the lamina. So it's right here and here. Do you know what lamina means? Layers, right. Like a sheet. It's sort of like a layer or a sheet of bone right here. So if you get laminate flooring.
Should that have holes in it?
Yes. What kind of a vertebrae is that?
Cervical.
It is.
I'm looking at the wrong thing.
No, you're fine. You're just looking at a cervical vertebrae. It's okay. We just haven't talked about those cervical vertebrae yet.
But the one you're looking at is thoracic?
Right, but there's still a pedicle here and a lamina here.
This looks like a thoracic to me.
Not with those holes, it doesn't.
Okay. So that's what is the determining factor, is that it's cervical because it has holes.
Okay, so my cervical vertebrae also has holes, see? Only cervical vertebrae have those holes. Those are called transverse foramina. Foramina just meaning plural because it has two of them, one here and one here. Do you know why they're called transverse? They're in the part that would be considered part of the transverse process. And if you look at this model here, These are, this is the occipital bone and then some cervical vertebrae and the spinal nerves coming out. Do you see the red arteries coming up and then they actually go into the brain? They fit through those holes. So the transverse foramen in the cervical vertebrae are passageways for the vertebral arteries. The vertebral arteries, along with the carotid arteries, are the two main blood vessels that feed your brain. How do the carotid arteries get into your brain? Carotid canal. Yeah. So there's a hole in the skull called the carotid canal, and that's how the carotid arteries come up the side of your neck and then get into your brain. The vertebral arteries get into your brain through the foramen magnum by coming up through the transverse foramen. Okay, so a cervical vertebrae. How do you know it's a cervical vertebrae? Two things that only cervical vertebrae have: transverse foramina and a forked spinous process. Thoracic vertebrae. How do you know it's a thoracic vertebrae? Well, in general, you could rule out cervical, right? And with this one, you might just know it's not lumbar because it's so much lighter looking. But there are more clear ways too. If you look on the sides of the transverse process, do you see the divot right here? It's called a facet, and it's for the head of the rib. So these are called transverse costal facets. And you can see them also on the body. There's a little divot right there. Each of the 12 thoracic vertebrae will have that, because if you look on a skeleton here, you'll see that each rib attaches to the body, and then for transverse foramen and a forked spinous process. Thoracic vertebrae look for a downward pointing spinous process and facets for the head of the ribs. Lumbar vertebrae would then be the rest of them, the heavier ones. But typically the spinous process is shorter and sticks out. Now, other markings that they all will have, but are most easily seen on the lumbar vertebrae, are the places where they connect with the vertebrae above and the vertebrae below. And those are called the superior articular process. Superior because it's on top and it articulates with another bone, and the inferior articular process. On this lumbar vertebrae, see how it's like almost like a cup? It's scooped right here. That's called the superior articular process, here and here. Then if I flip it upside down, right here and right here are the inferior articular processes. Those are most easily understood when you look at the articulated vertebral column. You can see how each inferior articular process articulates with the superior articular process of the vertebrae below it. It's actually really cool how they fit together, and it's because of those superior and inferior articular processes. Okay, so let's see if we did all of these. I showed you the cervical vertebrae. Atlas, boy, that's a funky looking vertebrae. It's very different than the others. One of these is not like the others. Right here, there is it still has those holes in the side though, so you're still going to know it's a cervical vertebrae. It has no body. It has no body, and it hardly has a spinous process. Its body is basically the dens, which is below it. And they sit together like that. So this is the axis. See how it has this bulbous thing coming up? That helps you do this motion. Turn your head and shake your head no. So this is the dens, and this is the axis. So this one I could ask 3 questions on. If I had a sticker here on the dens, and I said marking, you would say dens. If I had a sticker in that same spot and I said specific bone name, you would say axis is what the sticker's on, is that's the bone it's on. Or if I had that sticker in that same spot and I said type of vertebrae, it's a cervical. So make sure you read what I'm asking for of those 3 different possibilities. Okay, so notice though that the atlas and the axis don't have the fork spinous process, but they both do have the the transverse foramina. Okay, so cervical vertebrae, atlas and axis, vertebral prominence is C7. Then we did 12 thoracic vertebrae. Each one has costal facets. We should have this too. Let's try this. See if we can get a better view. Okay, there. Do you see that notch right there on the underside? What do you think comes out that notch? Here's the spinal cord coming down here. So those are where the spinal nerves come out. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves come out at each level. This is also very nicely seen on an articulated skeleton. The lamina is this part. The pedicle is a little harder to see on the lumbar vertebrae. It's very straightforward to see on the thoracic vertebrae. It's this chunk of bone, like a stalk between the body and the transverse process. And then the spinous process is here. And now we're ready for the ribs. So I just need a couple. And this is a rib. It fits on here like this. And the best way to look at that is to look at some skeletons in the room. But do you see how the rib touches the vertebrae in 2 places? One on the body and one on the transverse process. But the ribs only touch which type of vertebrae? Thoracic. Yeah. So you have a transverse costal facet on the vertebrae that articulates with this area near the tubercle of the rib. This bump right here is called the tubercle. See that bump? That's the tubercle of the rib. Tubercle means a bump or a projection. And then right here, the head of the rib articulates with the body of the vertebrae. Then there's something called the inferior groove. And you almost have to imagine it, but if you hold a rib in your hand and you feel the top and the bottom, one will feel like it has more of a sharp edge and the top will feel more rounded. So the bottom, oh, you can see it really well. No wonder I put a number on this one. You can even see the outline. That's called the inferior groove. And the intercostal nerves and some arteries, the intercostal arteries, that go to feed the muscles around your ribs, they travel in there. So those are the only markings on the rib, the head, the tubercle, and the inferior groove. And it fits together like this with thoracic vertebrae. Now the ribs you have 12 pairs of ribs because you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. And one thing I added on here, you can write this down if you want. There are 7